Her voice cut through the cabin like a snapped LL cable, sharp enough to make the row ahead fall silent. "You don't belong here. Move." First class froze. The kind of pause where people decide whether to step in or shrink back. The girl in the aisle seat didn't speak. Her chin was slightly lifted, her braids falling forward, hands folded over a small tote bag on her lap. The woman leaned in, her perfume heavy in the recycled air, eyes sweeping over the girl's hoodie and sneakers like they were proof she didn't deserve the seat. I said, "Move." A flight attendant slowed, glanced between them, and crouched just enough to take the boarding pass the girl held out. The woman's lips curved in a small, satisfied smile, as though she already knew how this scene would end. Then came the sound, slow, steady footsteps making their way down the aisle. Each one carried enough weight to shift the tension in the air. She had no idea whose shadow was about to fall across her shoulder. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I love seeing where our Echoes of Hope family is listening in from. The delay had already set the tone. We'd been sitting at the gate for nearly 30 minutes, the air inside the cabin carrying that restless buzz of passengers checking their watches, sighing, and shifting in their seats. The weather out of New York was rough, and Chicago wasn't much better. Everyone just wanted to get going. I was heading home after covering a business ethics conference, a routine assignment, nothing extraordinary. My seat, 2 rows behind the bulkhead, gave me a clear view of the aisle and most of the first-class section. That's where I first noticed her. She couldn't have been more than 16. Slim build, long braids, simple gray hoodie zipped halfway, dark jeans and sneakers that had seen better days. A paperback rested in her hands, and she was so absorbed in it that the surrounding tension seemed not to touch her. Her carry-on, a plain canvas tote, was tucked neatly under the seat in front of her. From the moment she'd settled in, I'd caught the sideways glances from across the aisle. A woman in a tailored cream blazer, her posture sharp enough to suggest she wanted everyone to know she belonged there. Her gaze lingered just a little too long, flicking from the girl's face to her shoes, then to the boarding pass still sticking out of the book like a makeshift bookmark. The girl didn't notice. Or maybe she'd learned to pretend she didn't. As the crew made their final checks, the woman's glances grew less discreet. There was a tightness in her mouth, a faint narrowing of the eyes, as though she was building a case in her head. I've been in enough rooms to recognize the start of a confrontation, and the way bias can travel faster than reason. And from where I sat, it was clear she'd already decided the girl didn't belong in that seat. The seatbelt sign hadn't even gone off when the woman's voice carried across the row, sharper now, no longer pretending to be curious. First class is for paying passengers, not for charity cases. A few heads turned, but not in outrage, more like people catching a bit of free entertainment. The girl's fingers tightened around her book, knuckles pressing white against the cover, but she didn't respond. A flight attendant appeared, leaning in with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" The woman gestured toward the girl as if pointing out a spill on the carpet. "She's in the wrong seat. I'm just trying to help get it sorted before we take off." The attendant crouched slightly, turning to the girl. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Her tone carried the unspoken message. Compliance was expected, resistance would be a problem. The girl handed it over. The attendant glanced at it, then straightened. "All right, let's just have you step into coach until we get this sorted." It was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that makes every sound louder. The click of a laptop closing, the faint rustle of someone shifting in their seat. I scanned the faces around us. A few passengers studying their phones like they'd suddenly become urgent reading, others with faint smirks, as though this was confirmation of something they'd believed all along. The girl finally lifted her head. Her voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it that made the words land harder than a shout. "My dad booked my ticket." The woman's eyebrow arched, her smirk deepening, as if that statement had just opened the door to more doubt rather than closing it. I leaned forward, my voice cutting into the space before the girl had to repeat herself. "She's in the correct seat. You can see that from the boarding pass you're still holding." The flight attendant glanced at me, surprise flickering across her face, before her expression hardened back into that thin, polite mask. "It's just procedure," she said, as if that explained everything. "Sometimes mistakes happen in seating. We'll just have her wait and coach until we verify." I'd heard that tone before, the kind that pretends to be neutral while shifting the burden onto the one least likely to be believed. My eyes went to the girl. Her cheeks were flushed now, the faint tremor in her hands giving away what her steady posture was trying to hide. She kept her gaze on the floor, as though meeting anyone's eyes would only feed the whispers. "You've already verified," I replied. "The pass matches her seat, her name, and this flight. Moving her would be unnecessary." The woman across the aisle gave a short laugh, the kind people use when they're sure they're right and think you're foolish for disagreeing. "Don't make a scene," she said, the words dripping with a kind of faux concern that masked something sharper. The attendant's voice lowered, but not enough to hide the edge. "Ma'am, I need her to move, or I'll have to involve security." That word, security, seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't a request anymore, it was a threat. The girl's shoulders stiffened, her fingers curling into the fabric of her tote. I felt the weight of the moment pressing in. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It never had been. It was about who they believed belonged in first class and who they were willing to push to the back, no matter what the facts said. "You can call security if you like," I said evenly. "But they'll be looking at the boarding pass too and wondering why a confirmed first-class passenger was told to give up her seat." The attendant straightened, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she masked it again. She didn't move, didn't walk away. Just stood there, the tension thickening in the few inches between her and the girl. Around us, the rest of first class stayed silent. Not one person spoke up. Not one person told the attendant they'd seen the girl sit down quietly, follow every instruction. And in that silence, I could feel the girl shrinking further into herself, the humiliation settling in like a weight that would follow her long after the flight. The attendant's hand tightened on the boarding pass. "Last chance," she said. And then, from somewhere behind us, those steady footsteps came again. Closer this time, measured and unhurried, pulling every eye in the cabin toward the front. If you stand for respect and truth, hit the subscribe button now and share in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know. The last passengers were trickling in, shuffling bags into overhead bins, when the footsteps stopped just behind the flight attendant. A tall black man stepped into the aisle space, not rushed, not loud, but with a presence that made people turn their heads without quite knowing why. His suit was dark and simple, the kind you notice only because of how well it fits. No flashy watch, no company logo, just quiet confidence that didn't need decoration. The girl finally lifted her gaze. "Dad?" It wasn't loud, but it carried enough to reach the woman across the aisle. Her lips curved into a smirk, the kind that says perfect. Now it'll be easier to clear them out. She leaned back slightly in her seat, already rehearsing whatever she thought she was about to say. He looked at his daughter first, the way a parent checks in with their child without a word passing between them. Then his eyes shifted to the flight attendant still holding the boarding pass. "Is there a problem here?" The attendant hesitated. "We're just verifying her seat, sir." "She's been in her seat since she boarded," he said evenly, "and that seat is exactly where she's supposed to be." The woman across the aisle tilted her head, voice pitched in mock reason. "Well, you know how these things can be. Mix-ups happen. I'm sure the crew just wants to make sure everything's in order." He turned his attention to her, expression unreadable. "And you are?" She faltered for half a beat. Just another passenger trying to help keep things moving. The corners of his mouth didn't so much as twitch. "Right." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and held out a business card to the attendant. "You might want to check the name on that before you decide what happens next." Her eyes flicked down, and I saw the shift before she even looked back up. The kind of shift that comes when someone realizes they're not speaking to just another customer. "This is Mr. Carter," she said, almost under her breath. "CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the country," he finished for her, his tone still calm, but with an edge that made it impossible to interrupt. And my company's been in talks with your airline about a long-term corporate travel agreement. I wonder what your executives would think of how this conversation started." The color drained from her face. The woman in the cream blazer shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to the window as if the sky outside offered a way out. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The weight of his presence filled the space, making it clear that the balance of power in this cabin had just shifted completely. He didn't waste time debating in the aisle. "I'd like a word with your captain," he said to the flight attendant, his tone still steady but leaving no room for negotiation. Her posture straightened instantly. "Of course, sir. One moment." She handed back the boarding pass to the girl, a small but telling detail, before making her way toward the cockpit. The change in the cabin was immediate. Just minutes ago, the woman in the cream blazer had been leaning back, smug in her assumption that she'd won this exchange. Now, her shoulders were pulled tight, one hand fussing with the strap of her handbag. The smirk had vanished. Passengers who had been pretending to be busy were now openly curious, glancing between the father, the girl, and the front of the plane. The low murmur of boarding chatter had shifted into a softer, sharper kind of whisper. The sound of people sensing they were in the middle of something bigger than a seating dispute. The father stayed right where he was, one hand resting on the back of his daughter's seat, the other loosely at his side. He didn't look around for support. He didn't need to. When the captain emerged, it wasn't with the rushed, distracted air of someone doing a favor. He approached with purpose, his expression careful but respectful. "Sir, I understand there's been a misunderstanding," he began, glancing at the girl and then at me. "I want to apologize on behalf of the crew for any discomfort this has caused." The word misunderstanding hung there, thin as paper, but it was enough to mark the shift in authority. The captain turned to the flight attendant who had started this chain of events. "Please make sure our first-class passengers are comfortable and undisturbed for the remainder of the flight." The attendant nodded quickly, her earlier firmness replaced by a strained politeness. The father gave a short nod in return, guiding his daughter to sit back as he took the seat beside her. He didn't gloat, didn't make a scene, just settled in like the matter was closed. But the crew's body language told another story. They weren't relaxed, they were recalculating. Even the woman across the aisle had shrunk into her seat, eyes fixed on the safety card in her lap, as though it held the answers to a test she hadn't studied for. The captain offered one last apology, this time looking directly at the girl. "You're right where you belong." And with that, the quiet in first class no longer belonged to her accuser. It belonged to her. The seatbelt sign was still lit, the engine still quiet, when he leaned slightly toward me. His voice was low enough not to carry, but clear enough to leave no doubt. "This airline's been trying to close a multi-million-dollar corporate travel deal with my company for months," he said. "Today, they closed it." Before I could respond, he was already reaching into his jacket, pulling out his phone. No flourish, no grand announcement, just a quick scroll, a tap, and a call placed with the same composure he'd shown since stepping on board. "Put me through to Harold," he said when the line picked up. "Yes, now." There was a short pause, then, "We're done. End the negotiations, and make sure they know why. I'll send you the details." The call lasted less than a minute. He hung up, slipped the phone back into his jacket, and turned his attention to his daughter, asking if she'd eaten breakfast before the flight. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. Up near the galley, I noticed movement, one of the attendants stepping into the aisle, leaning toward the purser with a look that could only be described as "something's wrong." Whispers passed quickly between them. Both glanced back toward the father, then toward the cockpit. It didn't take long for the shift to reach the rest of the crew. I caught fragments of their murmured exchange. "Senior leadership on the line? Yes. About this flight." The words "reassigned" and "effective immediately" floated back before the conversation dropped to a whisper again. The purser's professional mask slipped for just a second, enough to show the dawning realization. Whatever had been planned for the day was about to change, and not in her favor. The father didn't need to make a spectacle. The consequences were already in motion, moving faster than anyone could contain. What had started as a smug attempt to push a young girl out of her seat had now escalated to a call that would ripple all the way to the top floors of the airline's headquarters. The woman in the cream blazer was no longer smirking. Her fingers fidgeted with her necklace, her gaze fixed on the carpet. She looked like someone calculating whether to speak or stay silent, and realizing either choice would leave her exposed. The engines began to hum, the captain's voice breaking over the PA with the standard pre-takeoff announcements. But beneath the calm tone, there was an unspoken urgency, as if even he knew this flight had already made history, and not for the reasons anyone expected when they boarded. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I love seeing where our Echoes of Hope family is listening in from. The seatbelt sign had just clicked off when the woman in the cream blazer finally spoke again, her voice stripped of the earlier bite. "I was just concerned," she said, the words soft, almost apologetic, as if adjusting the tone could erase the memory of what she'd said before takeoff. The father didn't turn in his seat right away. He took a moment, letting the quiet stretch just enough for her discomfort to grow. When he did face her, his expression was steady, unshaken. "Concern without facts is prejudice," he said evenly. "And prejudice doesn't get to decide where my daughter sits." The words landed heavier than a shout. The woman's mouth opened slightly as if she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. She settled back, her fingers knotting together in her lap. Around us, the ripple effect was undeniable. The man 2 rows ahead suddenly found the window far more interesting. A woman with a tablet lowered it into her bag, eyes darting anywhere but toward the father and daughter. Even the few passengers who had been watching earlier with faint amusement now carried something else in their expressions. Discomfort, maybe even shame. The girl sat quietly, looking out the window, her posture relaxed for the first time since boarding. The earlier tension in her shoulders had eased, though her hands still rested protectively on the tote in her lap. Near the galley, one of the flight attendants passed by, wearing a smile so stiff it looked like it might crack. She stopped to ask if anyone needed anything, but her voice carried a faint tremor. Her eyes flicked to the father and then away again, landing on me for the briefest second before she moved on. The purser emerged a few minutes later, lingering near the front, her own polite expression betraying a tightness around the mouth. Every move from the crew seemed a little too precise, like they were following an invisible script and hoping it would end the scene as quickly as possible. The father returned to his conversation with his daughter, as though the interruption had never happened. His calmness wasn't dismissal, it was control. He'd said what needed to be said, and in that moment, the weight of it was enough to hold the entire cabin in a different kind of silence. The woman didn't speak again. And for the rest of the flight, every time an attendant passed their row, they slowed just slightly. A quiet acknowledgement of a wrong they couldn't take back. The rest of the cabin seemed to settle into an uneasy quiet, but my mind didn't. I kept replaying those first few minutes, the way the woman's voice had sliced through the air, the speed with which the crew had sided with her, and how quickly the situation might have gone differently if her father hadn't boarded when he did. I've seen enough to know this wasn't an isolated moment. It was a snapshot of something larger. The unspoken assumption that skin color still serves as a ticket checker, even when the boarding pass is plain to see. And for every incident like this in first class, there are countless more in airports, restaurants, and boardrooms that never make it past the moment. The girl was quiet, but there was a steadiness in the way she sat now, as though her father's presence had anchored her. I wondered how many times she'd had to sit through moments like that without him there to close the gap. From my seat, I could see the faint reflection of the passengers around us in the cabin window, their postures stiffer than when we first boarded. A few looked like they wanted to say something, but none did. Silence had been the safest choice in the beginning, and now it seemed like they didn't know how to break it. I thought about the way the captain had apologized, sincere, but couched in words like misunderstanding and discomfort. Language that blunts the truth so it can be managed without naming the real wound. I kept my gaze forward, not wanting to draw more attention to her, but I felt the weight of her presence beside her father. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not in this cabin. She was a reminder, a challenge, proof that money, status, and achievement don't dissolve prejudice. They just give you a bigger platform to confront it. Somewhere over the Midwest, the father leaned in slightly, speaking to her in a tone so low I couldn't hear the words. She smiled faintly and nodded. It wasn't the smile of someone who'd forgotten what happened, but of someone who knew it wouldn't be the last time, and who had just been reminded that she wouldn't be alone in it. And sitting there, I couldn't help thinking, not every young black girl gets that kind of protection when the world decides to question her place, and far too often, the world doesn't care to listen when she says she belongs. The descent into Chicago was as smooth as the rest of the flight had been tense. The usual shuffle of first-class passengers preparing to bolt off the plane began the moment the wheels touched down. Phones came out, bags slid from under seats, and the aisle filled with people angling to be the first out the door. The captain made the familiar announcement, granting first class the first chance to disembark, but the father didn't move. He stayed seated beside his daughter, calm and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. She mirrored his stillness, hands resting on her tote. One by one, passengers filed past them. Most avoided eye contact, their focus locked on the jet bridge ahead. The woman in the cream blazer stood quickly, clutching her handbag like a shield. She stepped into the aisle without a word, her gaze fixed on the floor until she disappeared into the stream of passengers. The crew managed polite goodbyes to those leaving, but I noticed they skipped the usual cheerfulness when their eyes passed over the father and daughter. There was a stiffness there. Not quite hostility, not quite remorse, just the knowledge that they'd been part of something that wouldn't vanish after the cabin emptied. When the last of the passengers had gone, the father finally rose, helping his daughter with her bag. He gave a brief nod to the purser, who returned it without meeting his eyes. As I gathered my own things, the girl turned slightly toward me. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but certain, "for not looking away." It wasn't dramatic, but it carried more weight than most thank yous. In that moment, I knew it wasn't just about me speaking up. It was about someone else being a witness, someone else seeing her take up space she had every right to claim. The father gave me a small, acknowledging glance before they stepped into the aisle together, side by side, walking toward the gate with the kind of dignity that can't be stripped by anyone's prejudice. She thought she could move a girl out of her seat. Instead, she moved the ground under her own feet. What started as an attempt to strip someone of her place became a lesson broadcast to every corner of that cabin. Dignity isn't granted by strangers, and it doesn't vanish under their scrutiny. It belongs to you the moment you decide you're staying right where you are. I've seen how easy it is for people to stay silent, to watch and then look away. But I've also seen how a single voice, even one spoken softly, can shift the balance. Sometimes that voice belongs to a bystander who refuses to be complicit. And sometimes it belongs to someone who carries enough weight in their name to make others stop and reconsider the cost of their prejudice. To the ones who speak up, even when it's uncomfortable, you make the air safer for everyone else in the room. And to those who carry themselves with dignity under fire, you remind the rest of us that worth isn't measured in the eyes that try to diminish you, but in the ones that see you clearly. Have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere? Share your story in the comments. It matters more than you think. And if you believe respect should never depend on skin color, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope. There are more stories to tell, more moments to witness, and more ground to move beneath the feet of those who think they can decide where we're allowed to stand.